In 1970, Chevrolet faced a problem, a big one. The muscle car wars were reaching their peak, and every manufacturer in Detroit was throwing everything they had into the ring. Pontiac had the GTO. Ford had the Boss 429. Dodge had the Hemi. And Chevy? Chevy had been playing it safe for too long. Their big blocks were good, sure, reliable, powerful enough. But they weren't the best. And in 1970, being good enough meant losing. This is the story of the Chevrolet 454 LS6, the last great big block engine of the muscle car era and the machine that saved Chevy's performance reputation when it mattered most. Along the way, we'll encounter corporate politics, engineering brilliance, emissions regulations that nearly killed everything, and an engine so powerful that Chevrolet actually lied about its output to keep the insurance companies off their backs. So, let us begin. But first, how did Chevrolet end up in a position where they needed saving in the first place? See, to understand the LS6, you have to understand what Chevrolet was dealing with in the late 1960s. And honestly, it's kind of embarrassing when you look at it from the outside. General Motors had a corporate policy, an internal rule that said no car under their umbrella could have an engine larger than 400 cubic inches unless it was a full-size vehicle. The reasoning was safety, supposedly. GM executives were worried about putting too much power in the hands of young drivers, which sounds noble until you realize that Ford and Chrysler had no such restrictions and were absolutely eating Chevy's lunch in the performance market. Think about that for a second. Chevrolet, the brand that had built its reputation on the small block V8, the brand that dominated NASCAR, the brand that was supposed to be America's performance leader, was handcuffed by its own parent company while the competition ran wild. The Camaro Z28 was limited to 302 cubic inches. The Chevelle SS topped out at 396. Meanwhile, Plymouth was dropping 440s and Hemis into everything with wheels, and Ford was cramming 428 Cobra Jets into Mustangs. Chevy dealers were losing sales every single day to customers who wanted more power and knew they could get it across the street. Now, I should mention that Chevrolet engineers weren't happy about this. Not even a little bit. They had the technology, they had the capability. What they didn't have was permission. So they did what engineers do when corporate gets in the way. They started planning for the day when the rules would change. And in 1969, that day finally came. GM lifted the displacement restriction, just like that. After years of internal lobbying, after watching market share slip away, after dealers complained loud enough and long enough, the executives in the tower finally relented. Chevrolet could now put whatever engine they wanted into whatever car they wanted. The floodgates were open, and Chevy was ready. The 454 cubic inch big block had actually been in development for a while. Chevy engineers knew the restriction wouldn't last forever, and they wanted to be first out of the gate when it lifted. The basic architecture was based on the Mark IV big block that had been around since 1965, but this was going to be something different, something special. For 1970, Chevrolet offered the 454 in two versions. The LS5 was the base model, if you can call 360 horsepower base. Hydraulic lifters, 10.25.1 compression ratio, a solid performer by any measure. But the LS5 wasn't what anyone was talking about. The LS6 was the one, the real one. The engine that would define Chevrolet performance for a generation and become arguably the most sought-after muscle car power plant ever built. Here's what made the LS6 different. Everything. Literally everything. The block was the same basic 454 cubic inch displacement, but that's where the similarities ended. Chevrolet's engineers went through every component and asked themselves one question: how do we make this the most powerful production engine we've ever built? The compression ratio jumped to 11.25.1. That's insane by today's standards, and it was aggressive even then. To handle that kind of compression, you needed premium fuel, the good stuff with actual lead in it. But the result was an engine that could extract every possible bit of energy from every drop of gasoline. The camshaft was a solid lifter design with aggressive timing. This wasn't some mild street cam designed for smooth idle and good fuel economy. The LS6 cam had significant duration and lift, which meant the engine made its power up high in the rev range and had a lumpy, aggressive idle that announced its presence before you even saw the car. The cylinder heads were the key to the whole thing. Chevrolet used rectangular port heads with massive 2.19-inch intake valves and 1.88-inch exhaust valves. The ports themselves were designed for maximum flow at high RPM, and the combustion chambers were shaped to promote efficient burning of the fuel-air mixture. These heads flowed air like nothing else Chevrolet had ever produced. The intake manifold was an aluminum dual-plane design feeding a Holley 780 CFM 4-barrel carburetor. The exhaust manifolds were heavy-duty cast-iron units designed to handle the heat and back pressure of sustained high-performance driving, and the bottom end, forged steel crankshaft, forged steel connecting rods, forged aluminum pistons. This wasn't an engine built to survive 50,000 miles of commuting. This was an engine built to survive repeated trips down the drag strip at wide-open throttle. The official horsepower rating was 450 at 5,600 RPM. The official torque rating was 500 pound-feet at 3,600 RPM. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Those numbers? They were lies. Deliberate lies. See, by 1970, the insurance companies had figured out what was happening in Detroit. They realized that muscle cars were getting more and more powerful, and that young drivers were buying them and doing exactly what you'd expect young drivers to do with 450 horsepower. Rates were skyrocketing. Some cars were becoming essentially uninsurable for anyone under 25, so the manufacturers started playing games with the numbers. They'd rate an engine at a lower power figure than it actually produced, or they'd test it with restrictive exhaust manifolds and air cleaners that would never be used in actual production. Anything to keep the insurance actuaries from having a heart attack. The LS6 was rated at 450 horsepower. Multiple independent tests, both then and now, have shown that a properly tuned LS6 produces well over 500 horsepower at the flywheel. Some estimates put it closer to 550. That's not speculation. That's dynamometer data. Think about that. In 1970, you could walk into a Chevrolet dealer, buy a production car with a factory warranty, and drive home with more than 500 horsepower under your right foot for about $4,000. The LS6 was available in exactly two vehicles for 1970, the Chevelle SS 454 and the El Camino SS 454. The Corvette would get the LS6 later, but for that first crucial year, it was a Chevelle-only proposition. The Chevelle SS 454 LS6 was, by any objective measure, the most powerful production car Chevrolet had ever built, and arguably the most powerful production car anyone had built up to that point. The combination of massive displacement, high compression, aggressive camshaft timing, and free-flowing heads created an engine that could embarrass anything else on the street. Acceleration was brutal. The LS6 Chevelle could run the quarter mile in the high 13-second range right off the showroom floor, with trap speeds approaching 110 miles per hour. With basic modifications, low 13s were easily achievable. Some racers got into the 12s with nothing more than slicks and headers. If you've made it this far, you're probably into this kind of stuff. Quick question. Where are you watching from right now? Drop it in the comments. And hey, subscribe if you haven't. We do this every week. All right, back to the LS6, because here's the thing about all that power. It created problems. The drivetrain had to be upgraded to handle the torque. The standard transmission for the LS6 was a Muncie M22 4-speed manual, commonly known as the Rock Crusher, because of the distinctive whining noise it made. The M22 used straight-cut gears instead of helical gears, which made it stronger but louder. It could handle the power, but just barely. The rear axle was a 12-bolt unit with 4.10 gears as the most popular option. The entire rear suspension was beefed up to handle the stress of repeated hard launches. Even so, owners learned quickly that the LS6 could destroy components that would last a lifetime in a normal car. The chassis struggled to keep up with the engine. The Chevelle was an intermediate-sized car, designed primarily for family transportation. Yes, the SS package added stiffer springs and bigger sway bars, but the basic structure was never intended for this kind of power. The front end would get light under hard acceleration. The rear tires would spin at almost any speed if you weren't careful. Driving an LS6 Chevelle fast required skill, real skill. This wasn't a car that made you feel like a hero. This was a car that would bite you if you weren't paying attention. And here's the tragic part of the story. The LS6 was already obsolete the day it was born. The writing was on the wall throughout 1970. Emissions regulations were coming. Insurance rates were already crushing sales of high-performance cars. The government was making noise about safety standards that would add weight and complexity to every vehicle sold in America. Chevrolet knew. Everyone knew. The muscle car era was ending, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. For 1971, the LS6 was gone, just like that. 1 year of production, and it was over. The 454 continued in detuned form with lower compression ratios to meet emission standards and accommodate the switch from leaded to unleaded gasoline. The LS5 stuck around, but its power dropped from 360 to 365 and then kept falling as the decade progressed. By 1972, the 454 was rated at 270 horsepower. That's not a typo. The same basic engine that had produced 450 plus in LS6 form was now struggling to break 300. Compression ratios had dropped. Camshaft timing had been softened. Restrictive emissions equipment choked the intake and exhaust. The muscle car era didn't end with a bang. It ended with a whimper. A gradual suffocation as regulations and insurance costs and changing consumer priorities combined to kill the most exciting period in American automotive history. But the LS6 went out on top, and that matters. See, here's the thing about the LS6's legacy. It proved something important. It proved that American engineers, when given the freedom and the motivation, could build engines that competed with anything in the world, not through sophisticated technology or exotic materials, but through the brute force application of displacement, compression, and airflow. The LS6 was not a complicated engine. It was, in many ways, a perfected version of technology that had been around for decades. Pushrod V8s weren't new. Big blocks weren't new. 4-barrel carburetors weren't new. What was new was the level of refinement, the attention to detail, the willingness to push every component to its absolute limit. And the engine worked. Not just worked, dominated. In a year when Chrysler had the Hemi and Ford had the Boss 429 and the 428 Cobra Jet, the LS6 stood at the top of the heap. More power, more torque, better streetability, lower price. The Hemi was exotic and expensive and required constant maintenance. The Boss 429 was a homologation special that never really worked properly as a street engine. The LS6 was a weapon you could buy, drive to work every day, and take to the drag strip on weekends without worrying about whether it would make it home. Now, I want to talk about what happened to these cars, because this is where the story gets really interesting. Chevrolet built approximately 4,475 LS6-equipped Chevelle for 1970. That's it. 4,475 examples of the most powerful production car in Chevrolet history. When you factor in the Corvettes that got the LS6 in 1971, the total production run was still under 10,000 units. That's nothing. Ford sold more Mustangs in a single month than Chevrolet sold LS6 cars in the entire production run. And here's the problem. Nobody knew they were rare at the time. To the buyers in 1970, the LS6 was just another option code. a very expensive option code granted, but nothing that suggested future collectibility. These were cars meant to be driven hard, raced, modified, and eventually used up. Many of them were. The survival rate of original LS6 cars is shockingly low. By some estimates, fewer than half of the original production run still exists in any form. Original unmodified examples are even rarer, which brings us to the present day. An original documented LS6 Chevelle, in good condition, is worth somewhere north of $150,000. Pristine examples have sold for over $200,000 at auction. The most desirable configurations, convertibles with 4 speeds and desirable color combinations, have approached $500,000. Think about that. A car that sold for $4,000 in 1970 is now worth 100 times that amount, more in some cases. The LS6 has become one of the most valuable and sought-after muscle cars ever built, and the engine itself has achieved legendary status among collectors and enthusiasts. Original LS6 engines, even removed from their original cars, command premium prices. The heads, the intake manifold, the carburetor, even the specific casting numbers on the block, all of it matters to collectors who are trying to assemble or restore authentic examples. The LS6 has also had an outsized influence on Chevrolet's modern performance efforts. When GM revived the LS designation for their modern small block V8 engines in the late 1990s, it wasn't an accident. The marketing people knew exactly what they were doing. They were connecting the new engines to the legacy of the LS6, trying to capture some of that magic for a new generation. And in some ways, they succeeded. The modern LS engines, the LS1 and LS6 and LS7, and all the rest, have become legends in their own right. They're the foundation of Chevrolet's current performance program, the engines that power the Corvette and the Camaro and countless aftermarket builds. The philosophy is the same as it was in 1970: displacement, airflow, power, just executed with modern technology and materials. But there's something about the original LS6 that can't be replicated, something that goes beyond the numbers and the specifications. The original LS6 was built in an era when everything was possible, when engineers could push compression ratios to 11.1 and design camshafts for maximum power without worrying about emissions or fuel economy or noise regulations. When a manufacturer could build an engine specifically designed to dominate drag strips in street races and not care what the government thought about it. That world is gone. It's never coming back. Modern engines are better in almost every measurable way. They're more powerful, more reliable, more efficient, cleaner. A modern Camaro ZL1 would absolutely destroy an LS6 Chevelle on any track, in any competition. But the LS6 represents something that numbers can't capture. It represents a moment in time when American automotive manufacturers were willing to build the most powerful, most exciting, most uncompromising engines they possibly could, simply because they could, because the competition demanded it, because their customers wanted it, because it was fun. The LS6 was Chevrolet's answer to a challenge. Ford and Chrysler had thrown down the gauntlet, and Chevy responded with the biggest, baddest engine they had ever built. No excuses, no compromises, just pure, unadulterated American horsepower. And it worked. For one glorious year, the LS6 sat at the top of the mountain, the most powerful engine in the most powerful car, available to anyone with $4,000 and the courage to drive it. And what of the men who designed it? The engineers who pushed the limits of what a production engine could be? Most of them continued working at General Motors through the dark years of the 1970s and beyond. They watched their creations get detuned and strangled and eventually replaced by smaller, less exciting power plants. Some retired, some moved to other companies. A few lived long enough to see the revival of American performance in the 1990s and 2000s, to see their work honored and celebrated by a new generation of enthusiasts. The LS6 itself lives on in restoration shops and private collections and museum displays around the world. Every year there are fewer original examples. Every year, the ones that remain become more valuable. Eventually, they'll all be gone, replaced by recreations and tributes and memories. But the legend will remain. The legend of the engine that proved Chevrolet could build the best. The engine that defined what a muscle car could be. The engine that went out on top right before the world changed forever. And that is the story of the Chevrolet 454 LS6. Subscribe if you want more, and let me know in the comments, had you heard of this engine before? Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.